أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة الدائمة الباقية على أعدائهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. صلوات عليه. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the opportunity to once again be part of the Azaa of Sayyid al-Shuhada. I would like to thank the Mu'mineen, brothers and sisters who have been doing dua for me. Your duas have been, fulfilling. There's just a little bit swelling left on my foot, and inshallah that also will go away soon, inshallah. We commemorated the Arba'een of Sayyid al-Shuhada on the weekend. And in a way, we are now coming towards the end of the Azaa of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Keeping that in mind, I would like to talk about one of the important segments of this tradition of Azaa that we do. And that has to do with the issue of Marsiya. Marsiya in Farsi, Arabic, in Urdu, even Gujarati. This is basically poetry. In poetry also you have different types of poetry. When you talk about qasida, this is in praise of someone. Whereas when we talk about Marsiya, this is basically elegy, where the poem is more talking about the grief and sorrow and suffering of an individual or a group. And when we look at this tradition, this is what I would like to talk about it, whether the system of having a Marsiya before the majlis, is this just a cultural thing, or is this something which is part of our religious traditions? But before that, let us even understand this whole role of poetry and Marsiya in our religion and history. Because if you look at the way we are taught in the Hausa, there is a subject called, besides Islamic laws and jurisprudence and theology, there is also a subject taught which is known as al-mantiq. Al-mantiq means logic. This is a prerequisite before you go into philosophy. And in one of the earlier discussions in mantiq is about the definition of a human being from the logical point of view. And there we are told that, well, if you look at a human being and compare a human being with an animal, there is many common things between the two. Especially when you look at the power of desire and the power of anger, ghazab and shahwat. The element of desire is there, which pushes animal as well as human beings to seek whatever they perceive to be beneficial for themselves. And the element of anger is there, where an animal or a human being, when they perceive something to be harmful, they will always be away from it or prevent that from themselves. So this element of ghazab and shahwat is common between human beings as well as animals. And therefore, in mantiq, we are told an animal is a haywan and a human being also is a haywan. But what is the difference between the two then? What is the distinctive mark of a human being versus the animals? In logical perspective, we are told that the difference is the intellect. Animals cannot, think, reflect, express their ideas and thoughts and their feelings. Whereas human beings can dream, can think about issues, and they have this special ability of speaking where they can communicate their ideas, their thoughts, and their feelings to the others. The ability of speaking is known as nutq. Based on that, in logic we are told animals are haywan samit. The animals are basically silent animal. You cannot talk to an animal. Whereas a human being is haywanun natiq. It's a speaking animal. This is where we differentiate between one and the other. So this ability to express our ideas, our thoughts, our feelings with others is basically the distinctive mark of a human being versus the animals. And when we look at this ability to speak, this is done either in form of prose or poetry. Majority of the people, of course, they have the ability to express their ideas in prose, in their own ways, of expressing things. But there are some among human beings who have the ability to express their own ideas and feelings in poetry form. And so you have nasr and you have shi'r. And when we look at both these elements of expressing the ideas, they are very powerful. You look at the nations around the world, you look at the civilizations, across the board, doesn't matter whether you're Muslim, non-Muslim, believer, non-believer, this element of prose and poetry is actually a sign of a society or a civilization, whether it's dead or alive. If there is a community where there is no poetry anymore, it means that that society is basically intellectually it's dying. And this is where we see that poetry plays a very important role in human history and human society. Even in Islam. In Islam, you will see there is a surah in the Quran by the name of Surah Al-Shu'ara. Shu'ara is plural of sha'ir. Sha'ir means poet. So Shu'ara means poets. It's interesting that at the end of this surah, Allah talks about the Shu'ara, and He begins negatively. The Quran first condemns the poets. But then Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes an exception. Look at the way Allah talks about it. And basically what it means is that if poetry is, what is the purpose of the poetry? If it is there to promote the animalistic, lower desires of a human being, taking them away from their spirituality and their character, then that sha'iri, poetry, is condemned, the way we see in the movie and music industry. But if that poetry is used to elevate the ideas and concepts in the minds of the people, to refine their character, to encourage them to do good, then that shairi and that poetry is praiseworthy in Islam. Look at the ayat. وَالشُّعَرَاء يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَهِيمُونَ. As for the poets, Allah says, only those people who go astray follow them. Don't you see them? They're wandering in different valleys. They are not really serious into what they are doing. And إِنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ مَا لَا يَفْعَلُونَ. And these poets are basically, they say one thing but do something else. At the end, Allah make the exception, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Except those poets who have iman in Allah, who do good deeds, وَذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, and they remember Allah all the time, most of the time. So iman, amal salih, and zikr of Allah, even when they are composing poetry and they have Allah in their mind, that poetry and that poet is praiseworthy in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not only that, a poet is somebody who can become the voice of the people, especially when people are mazloom. So the next ayat, وَانْتَصْرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا. And the poets are the one who seek help through their poetry when they are oppressed. So the poet in every society, when the time comes, they become the voice of the community, especially in a community which is Muslim. Keep that in mind, and then you will see what is the importance of poetry in our religion. Historically, even if you look at the way Quran was revealed, those who know the Arabic language will not be able to appreciate the miraculous nature of the Quran unless they are familiar with the poetry of the era of Jahiliyyah. Why was Quran revealed as a miracle? Because in the era of Jahiliyyah, Arabs were jahil except in one thing. They had very good talent in sha'iri. They used to compose very great, pieces of poetry, and the best of this year would be hung on the wall of the Kaaba until the next competition they have on an annual basis. And because they were very much at the higher level of their poetry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to send the Quran as a challenge to their best of talents. That you are able to compose the best of poetry, now I'm sending something which is not poetry, but when it comes to eloquence, clarity, and the flow, it is better than what you have. And try to bring something like that. And so even to understand Quran, you need to understand the poetry of the era of Jahiliyyah. Historically, if you look at the important figures in our history, Abu Talib was a very accomplished poet of his own time. You know, these Muslims who go around and saying, oh, Abu Talib was a kafir and Abu Sufyan was a Muslim. They don't need to go here and there and say whether he said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah and Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. If they just go to the Arabic literature and look at the poetry of Abu Talib, they will see very clearly that Abu Talib is there supporting the cause and the ideas and the faith of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Salawat Quran. In the days of the Prophet in Medina, there were many poets there. One of them from Medina by the name of Hassan bin Sabit al-Ansari, a very famous poet of the time. When he became Muslim, he became, in a way, poet of the Prophet. In all important events, when he was there, he would right away compose poetry in memory of that event. He is also there in the event of Ghadir. When the Prophet, declared Amir al-Mu'minin, when he says, Man kunta mawla'u fa'adha Ali al-Mawla, now our brothers say, oh, Mawla means friend, and not Awla and Imam. Well, one way of understanding what was the meaning of the word Mawla when Prophet uttered those words is to go and see how Hassan bin Sabit, a learned person of that time, a poet, how he, explained the story in his poetic way. And there he says that the Prophet presented Ali as Imaman wa Hadiya. He explains the word Mawla as Imaman wa Hadiya, as a leader and a guide of the Ummah. Salawat Quran. Amir al-Mu'minin himself was a poet. There is a whole divan. Not only his sayings, but even his poetry has been compiled. There is a divan of Ali bin Abi Talib. And if you look at his companions, there were many who were very talented orators and speakers and poets in their own right. And then you come to the Umayyad era. You look at the time of the events of Karbala. The day of Ashura, the day is the day of poetry on both sides. How the people from the side of Imam Hussain alayhi salam would come to the battlefield, introduce themselves in poetic form. Even Imam Hussain alayhi salam himself has said many verses on that day. One of the most famous one is one where he says, Al-Maut awla min الموت أولى من ركوب العار والعار أولى من دخول النار. He says, death for me is preferable than disgrace. I don't want to be disgraced by accepting Yazid. I would rather die. And in the second line he says, وَالْعَارَ أَوْلَ مِنْ دُخُولِ النَّارِ. But if I am given a choice, worldly disgrace on one side and Jahannam on the other side, he says, of course, I will accept worldly disgrace, but not entering into the Nar and Jahannam. So this is part of the even seerah and the example of our Imams. You know, even if you look at some of the young people in Karbala, the way they express their own identity and their loyalty to the Imam, it's really very powerful. And that is something we need to study on its own. Later on, you have, during the days of the fourth Imam, you have Farazdaq, a very famous poet of that time. Then you have Syed Himyari. And then you have Kumayt al-Asadi. And after that we come to the days of the 7th, 8th Imam, Da'b al-Khuzai, and many others, including when we come to the time of the 9th and 10th Imam, Ibn Sakid. These are some very famous poets of that time who were Shia, and they used their tool and their weapon of words and poetry in order to spread the message of Shia faith in the Muslim world at that time. Salawat Parnak. Now this was just about the general issue of poetry. But when we talk about Marsiya of Karbala, this tradition of where a person sits down and renders a story or one event of Karbala in poetry form, Marsiya, elegy. This is not cultural. This is not just a tradition started in India, for example. No, this is actually encouraged by the Imams. Rather, I would say one thing. The majlis is a byproduct of Marsiya. Marsiya was there first, and because Marsiya was there, the idea was now that people are gathering, their hearts are becoming soft to hear the message of Hussein. Let us get a learned person to come and talk about our faith. So we educate ourselves even more, make ourselves better Shias of Ahlul Bayt. So it's not Majlis which was there and Marsiya came later on. Marsiya was first. The Majlis, in the sense of speech, came as a later component of the Azan of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Salawat. Just 3 examples from our 6th Imam, where a person by the name of Abu Harun al-Makfuf, he came to the 6th Imam. He was a poet. And Imam says, Ya Abu Harun, anshidni fil Hussein. Recite Marsiya for Hussein. So he recited, and Imam heard and cried. Now remember, poet does not always portray the events the way they are exactly. When you narrate an issue, your hands are tied. You have to be in line with what is the fact and the sources that you have. But when you talk about poetry, you have this leeway of taking something and then elaborating on it. So there's a difference in Nasr and Sha'r, between prose and poetry. And so Imam then told him that, okay, you recited, but I would like you to recite Fanshidni kama tanshiduni. Recite it the way you recite in the gatherings, with feeling and sorrow. So he recited again until Imam cried, and he says, I even heard the women behind the curtain, even crying on my Marsiya. And when he finished, Imam says to him, Ya Harun, man anshada fil Hussein shi'ran, fabaka wa abka asharan, kutiba lahul jannah. When a person composes only one line of poetry for Hussein, and he cries and makes 50 people cry on that, Jannat becomes wajib on him. Then Imam says, Man anshada fil Hussein shi'ran fabaka wa abka khamsatan kutibat lahul jannah. You know, if he composes one share, one line of poetry, cries and makes 5 individuals cry, Jannat is wajib on him. And then Imam goes even to 1. Even if he makes only 1 person cry, Jannat becomes wajib on him. Another incident where Abu Ammar al-Munshid comes to the Imam, and Imam again says, you know, I hear that you say Marsiya on Hussein. I would like to hear from you. And again, same thing happened as Abu Harun. And then Imam goes into more detail. He says, Man anshada fil Hussein shi'ran fa'abka al-khamseen falahu al-jannah. Whoever composes a poetry on Hussein and he cries and makes 50 people cry, Jannat is for him. And then Imam goes to 40 individuals, then 30 individuals, then 20 individuals, then 10 individuals, then 1 person. And at the end Imam says, وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ شِعْرًا فَبَكَى. When a person composes one poetry on Hussein and he himself cries, له الجنة, he will have Jannat. وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ شِعْرًا فَتَبَاكَى فَلَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. If a person composes poetry on Hussein and doesn't cry but makes the face of somebody who is sad, even he will have Jannah. And finally, one from Salih bin Uqba, another poet of the 6th Imam's time, where similar words are used when he talked about the issue of Marsiya. So when we look at this tradition, we have to realize that this is not only just a cultural issue, it is something which has been encouraged by the Imams. There's an incident where Da'ab al-Khizai came and recited his qasida in presence of the 8th Imam, where he talks about the way the Ahlul Bayt have been scattered around. He says, in a line of poetry, he says, there is one whose grave is in Kufa, others who are there in Medina, and others have been buried in Karbala, and there is one grave of the Imam who is in Baghdad. Imam Riza stopped him. In Urdu we call tazmeen. The same rhythm of the poetry that Da'bal was using for his qasida, Imam says, stop. You only talked about Kufa, Baghdad, Karbala and Medina. Then Imam composed 2 lines, extempore, 2 lines of poetry in the same rhythm as the qasida of Da'bal, where he says, and soon there will be a grave in Tus, referring to his own, shahadat. And so when you look at this, it's not only that qasida or a marsiya is being recited, Imam is actually now becoming part of that recitation and composing of that marsiya or qasida. Salawat pढ़ने एक बार और. And so you'll see the Arabs, the followers of Ahlul Bayt among the Arabs, are into this tradition of Marsiya. Even now, you look at among the Farsi-speaking people, Turkish-speaking people, you go to Afghanistan, you go to South Asia, Kashmiri language, Punjabi language, Sindhi language, Gujarati, and of course Urdu, which is the common language of Muslims in South Asia, where poets like Mir Anis have reached to the level where nobody has been able to pass their poetry in Urdu about Karbala. All experts of Urdu literature and poetry, even if they are Sunni or Hindu, they are forced to study the poetry of Mir Anis, the Marsiya of Mir Anis, because of the high level of eloquence and clarity of his Marasi. And we see, even if you study the history of Shias now in East Africa, my father, when he did the research about the early evidence of presence of Shias in East Africa, there is now actually a piece of poetry in Swahili produced in 18th century known as Yutenzi ya Sayyidina Hussein bin Ali, which was not from Shia Isna but probably from some Arabs who had come and settled in East Africa. And they composed this Marsiya of Karbala from their own perspective. And even now, if you go, of course, now there are many Shia in East Africa, Africans, and if you go to any of their julus or programs in Dar es Salaam, you will see they are composing poetry and marasi of Imam Hussein in the Swahili language. So this tradition is a living tradition. Don't think this is only a cultural thing. We in this part of the world have to think about it, that what are we going to do? Those who have been able to maintain their language, I will say encourage your children to learn your language. Whether it's Gujarati or Urdu or Farsi or Arabic, and encourage them to study the Marsiya in their own languages. But those who have now only adopted English as the only language they know and speak and dream about it, it is time for the community, the madrasas, various programs that we have, to train our children to compose Marsiya in English. This is how this tradition has to continue. It is there in all different languages, but it is time to think about it in that way so that in future we would have Marsiya in this English language also. Salawat Pradhan Iqbal. In the first Ashra, I was in Vancouver in one of the Saturday nights that organized a poetry competition among the youths. And I was asked to judge. It's only when I started listening to the few presentations, mostly done by the girls. They seem to have more talent of, poetry than the boys. But I realized it's going to be a very, difficult task for me to judge. Each one of them were good in their own ways. And they used, as I said, in poetry you have this leeway. Especially one which I cannot forget is one where a girl has basically narrated the Rukhsat-e Akhir, the last, farewell of Hussein from Ahl Haram and Sakina through the eyes of Zuljana. The whole poetry is Zuljana looking at things, observing things, and narrating what happened. And so the talent is there, and we have to do that. We have to make them imbibe that love for Imam Hussain alayhi salam. It's only when it is in there, it will come out in the language that they know. And so this is something we have to keep in mind, that it's not only a cultural thing. This is actually the foundation of the Azan of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Salawat Pradhan Iqbal. Many of the shu'ara of Ahlul Bayt, especially during the days of Imam, are shaheed. They have been killed because of their, language, because of their using this power of poetry that he had. Ibn Sakid was actually made a teacher of Arabic language by Mutawakkil for his sons. Although Mutawakkil knew that Ibn Sakid is a Shia, but because of his talent and his ability and his expertise in the Arabic language, he asked him to become the tutor. He didn't like it, but the circumstances didn't allow him to say no. But one day, Mutawakkil, in the height of his hatred towards Ali and Ali, came there and he says to Mutawakkil, "What do you think about my two sons? Are they better or Hassan and Hussein?" Ibn Sakid couldn't take that. There was no more time for taqiyya there. And he said, "You're talking about Hassan and Hussein? I don't consider even you to be equal to the slave of Ali, Qambar. Khambar was better than your sons and yourself put together. And that is where he lost his life. Mutawakkil ordered him to be tied, and because he's a poet using his tongue for the Ahlul Bayt, he was killed by cutting off his tongue. And so this tradition that we have is coming as a legacy of those who have worked in this field to promote the Mazhab Ahlul Bayt, and they have given their life and their blood for this cause. To cherish that in that way and continue and make the next generation among those who will continue this tradition of the Marsiya of Hussein bin Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. Salawat. अरबईन का ज़माना है, अहले हरम के ख़वातीन ने भी शायरी के ज़रिए और मरसिया के ज़रिए अपने मज़लूमियत को पेश किया है। यह काफ़िला जब मदीना पहुँचा है, इमाम ज़ैनुल आबिदीन अलैहिस्सलाम ने बशीर से कहा था, जो गाइड बना था, कि बशीर हम अपने नाना के शहर में इस तरह से नहीं जाएंगे, तो मदीने वालों को खबर कर दो कि हम आ रहे हैं। काफ़िले को रोका गया शहर के बाहर, लेकिन वहाँ पे इमाम ने बशीर से कहा, बशीर तुम्हारे बाबा शायर थे, क्या तुम भी शेर कहते हो? तो बशीर ने कहा कि हाँ कोशिश करते हैं। तो इमाम ने कहा कि ठीक है, हमारे आने की खबर शेर में देना। बशीर जाते हैं अपने घोड़े पर, मस्जिद नबी के बाहर खड़े होते हैं और दो शेर कहे हैं, जहां खिताब है या अहला यथरिब ला मकाम लकुम बिहा, ऐ मदीना के रहने वालों, ऐ यसरिब के रहने वालों, अब ये रहने की जगह नहीं है। क़ुतिल अल हुसैन फदमई मिदरारा, हुसैन कत्ल हो चुके हैं, तुम रो और आंसू बहाओ। रअसुहु अलल क़नात युदारो, हुसैन का सर तो नोक नेज़ा पर एक शहर से दूसरे शहर में घूम रहा है, लेकिन हुसैन का लाशा ज़मीन करबला में पड़ा हुआ है। और ये ऐलान था मदीने वालों के लिए कि हुसैन का ख़ानदान आ चुका है। बनु हाशिम के लोग भी जमा होते हैं, सब जाते हैं वो काफ़िला जहाँ रुका था। जो जज़्बात और जो एहसासात अहले हरम में उस वक्त थे, आप समझ सकते हैं कि वतन पहुँचने में क्या कैफियत रही होगी। लेकिन सिर्फ एक मंजिल पर हम ला के मजलिस को ख़त्म करना चाहेंगे कि जब यह काफ़िला शहर मदीना में वारिद हुआ है, सबसे पहले रसूल के कब्र की ज़ियारत के लिए जाते हैं। जनाब ज़ैनब, जनाब उम्म कुलसूम, इमाम ज़ैनुल आबिदीन, सब के सब रोज़े रसूल पे जाते हैं और वहाँ पर जनाब उम्म कुलसूम ने एक मरसिया पढ़ा है, जहाँ ज़ैनब ने सबसे पहले शहर मदीना को खिताब किया है। मदीना तो जद्दिना ला तक़बलीना फ़बिल हसरात वल अहज़ान जिना, ऐ हमारे जद के शहर हमें कबूल न करना, इसलिए कि हम लौट के तो आए हैं लेकिन हम गम और हुज़्न को लेके आए हैं। खरजन मिन के अहलीन तुर्रन, हम तुम्हारे शहर को हमने जब छोड़ा था तो पूरा कुंबा मेरे साथ था। रजाना ला रिजाला वला बनीना फीना, आज हम लौट के आए हैं लेकिन न कोई मर्दों में साथ है, न जवानों में हमारे साथ है। आखिर में रसूल से मुखातब होते हैं, वख़बिर जद्दिना इन्ना उसरना, कि हमारे जद को खबर कर दो कि मुझे असीर बनाया गया और असीर के बाद हमें कैदी बनाया गया। ऐ रसूल कद ज़बहुल हुसैन वलम युराउ जनाबिक या रसूलुल्लाह फीना, ऐ रसूल आपके हुसैन को इन्होंने ज़बा कर दिया और आपके हुर्मत को कोई पास न रखा। आखिर में उस कब्र की तरफ मुखातब होती है, फातिमा को याद करती है, अफातिमु लौ नज़रती इला सबाया, ऐ फातिमा अगर आप इन कैदियों को देखती کرتی تو اس وقت آپ کو اندازہ ہوتا کس طرح سے آپ کی بیٹیوں کو ایک شہر سے دوسرے شہر لے جایا گیا۔ اس کے بعد فرماتی ہے اے ماں آپ کہتی تھی اتنے مصائب آپ پر پڑے ہیں کہ اگر دن پر پڑتے تو تاریخ شب میں بدل جاتے۔ فاطمہ اے ماں ہم پر دیکھ نظر کرتی اندازہ ہوتا کہ آپ کے مصائب کچھ نہیں تھے۔ آخر میں فرماتی ہے اے ماں سکینت تشتکی من بر و جد، کاش آپ سکینہ کو دیکھتی کس طرح سے پریشانوں میں شکایت کرتی تھی۔ تنادی الغوث یا رب العالمین، جب بھی اذیت پڑتی تھی اللہ کو پکارتی تھی اے رب العالمین مدد فرما۔ الا لعنۃ اللہ علی القوم الظالمین سیعلم الذین ظلموا ای منقلب ینقلبون۔ خداوند اس خیر بات قبول فرما، ہمارے گناہوں کو بخش دے، ہمارے توفیقات میں اضافہ فرما، امام کے ظہور میں تعجیل فرما۔ ربنا تقبل منا انک انت السمیع العلیم۔